Well, hello and welcome to everybody who chose to join us today. We are really excited that with all of the choices you had available to you in this afternoon session that you chose to join us for this conversation. So hopefully you are here in the session you want to be in. We are looking at queering math and ELA curriculum. So we're going to do quick introductions today. Erin, do you want to go first since you're in the lovely blue box?
Sure. My name's Erin Cary. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I work in South Minneapolis for Lindale Neighborhood Association as the Associate Director and as an ELL instructor for Lindale Education Program, and I am an out queer educator.
And my name is Amber Delliger. I am in the green box on the right. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I work for Metro North Adult Education in the Anoka Ramsey Community College Partnership. I focus on DevEd math instruction, which is low-level math up to college prep. And I also am a student success coach. I am also an out queer educator. My wife is also a teacher, so we are really excited to be able to have space for this session today. Awesome. So our agenda today is pretty easy. We are hopefully going to have a lot of opportunity for conversation. So this is our guide, but if we need to have other conversations, there's some space for that. It is only 45 minutes, so there's no way possible for us to have a full conversation about all of this. So we hope that you take today's agenda as a starting point rather than a fixed journey. So we're going to start today by defining some vocabulary that we are going to be using in our session. We're going to talk about why, what is queering and why this work is important, not only for our field and for us as practitioners, but also for our students and our communities. We're going to talk about 3 opportunities that we have to maybe queer our instruction and how to make that a meaningful part of our normal instructional routines. We're going to give you a few examples. Examples are going to be a small part of our session today because we view you as experts. You know your content area and your students better than we ever will. But we're going to give you a few examples so that you can have a little bit of a picture of what we're talking about when we're using these terms. We're going to then share some additional resources that we have there. Erin and I have had a great time exploring some resources that are out there. And then hopefully we'll have a good amount of time at the end to answer some questions you might have as we go along.
Thank you, Amber. So just a few non-objectives for our session to give you a little bit of a picture in your mind of the goals of what we will be talking about. Some of you may have had the chance already to attend a sort of 1.0 session that I presented over the past couple of years at various events with Chris Kloss and Jamie Kreil, where we walked through the LGBTQIA+ acronym and kind of, introduced those terms and gave some perspective on opportunities for queering ABE spaces and curriculum. That session is still available through Literacy Minnesota. We give that twice a year as part of their social justice and equity certificate. So we are presenting that biannually. If you check out their website, you will be able to join us and catch that one if you haven't. So we're going to move on from some of the topics covered there. Maybe a little bit less intentional discussion of queering ABE spaces, intake documents, materials around marketing, advertising, that kind of thing that is covered more in the quote unquote 1.0 session. So we're focusing more on curriculum for ELA and math today. And this is also not a comprehensive pedagogical or andragogical framework. These are the views of just 2 practitioners from the queer community.
So, as we're getting started today, we do want to encourage this to be a conversation. Part of the querying experience is that this doesn't have to be or feel like a normal session that you maybe have attended. We want to encourage you as you feel comfortable to get engaged. The chat is open and we are watching it. So, we want to encourage you to really be a part of that. For those of you who are watching this session recorded at a different time, jot down those questions as you're having them, pause the video, and really make sure that you're recording those things that you're thinking, because those are all a really important part of the norm shift that we're hoping to make. So the first part of our session today is going to be defining some really important terms and showing you how we're going to think about those in terms of this session. So our first term here is cis-heteronormativity, which has lots of letters. It might look really overwhelming, but essentially we're looking at, and I'll let you read this definition here, but essentially what we're looking at is how we're viewing identity and gender and how that responds to our birth sex, and the idea that heterosexuality is normal or the default in our community. And so looking at how we need to remember this lens as we're planning. So I'll give you a second here to kind of review this term, and then Erin will move on to our next one.
Feel free to put any questions in the chat. So yes, cisgender. I think this is a term maybe many people will have heard or maybe heard but not been totally sure about. So we can talk about that. This is referring to gender identity. As you may know, heterosexual is referring to opposite sex or being attracted to a different gender from your own, whereas homosexual is referring to being attracted to your own gender. Cis refers to your gender identity. So if you are a person who is born with assigned to a gender that you ultimately don't identify with, you are considered trans, or you may choose to take on a trans identity, whereas cis people feel in tune with the gender that they were assigned at birth. So many people will view cis as a default expectation of gender, which of course kind of ignores the fact that trans identity is normal and part of a typical gender identity spectrum.
Absolutely. And thank you, Marisa, for including in the chat that our non-binary friends are really important in these conversations too, especially as we are finding more people in our communities are finding more comfort in those other than cis gender identities. So keeping in mind that this term kind of defines that default that our culture automatically goes to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'll use myself as an example. I was assigned female at birth and I identify as a female. So I am cisgender. Okay, moving on to the term queering, which we'll use a lot in our session today. This is a term that you may have heard in different contexts. So as a verb, queering became popular in more academic university sort of contexts or theoretical contexts in the 1980s and 90s. It had been used before, but kind of became popularized at this time. It is about taking a lens or an approach to any kind of discourse, maybe teaching, maybe literary analysis, maybe approaching math or other academic pursuits, but challenging and reimagining cis-heteronormative views and approaches to that discourse. So finding a new way or a deconstruction of traditional and sort of received ideas about how we think about different areas. This quote was very helpful to me, or the quote toward the bottom, from Thalatha Nikki Young, who's a professor. at Bucknell University. She said, queering deconstructs the logics and frameworks operating within old and new theological and ethical concepts. Queering dismantles the dynamics of power and privilege persisting among diverse subjectivities. So this was first kind of associated with gender and sexuality. Maybe you would do a queer reading of, say, To Kill a Mockingbird and look at the character of Scout and how she does or does not conform to gender expectations and what that may mean about her position in society. But then it sort of, queering became broadened as more of an umbrella term for addressing identity or a range of like systems of oppression and identity politics in a lot of different areas, not just literary analysis. So we can think of queering as challenging sort of white Western dominant concepts of things like time and space, bodies, gender roles, family structures, and also questioning binaries, I think, is a key part of queering. The point is there's no fixed reference point, and the idea of like realities is not stable. There's a lot of perspective that makes up the world. So we have a quote from an EL educator from Washington who has been writing about queer ELT classroom practices, and I benefited a lot from his article about full of suggestions for educators. Here he says, queering our educational practice means equipping students with the habits of mind to be critical about all normative discourses, not just ones centered on sexual identity. Does anyone want to respond to that or ask a question, make a comment? Maybe people are typing. I will say I see this queering work as sort of being about disrupting norms and power holding in our curricula and our classrooms and unsettling the expected or the received meanings that a lot of us were raised with in a dominant discourse. Okay. So feel free to comment in the chat, but we'll continue.
And this idea that we're not just going to strictly focus on sexual identity or sexual orientation is really important as we go through this session. And you're going to see through our examples that this idea of disrupting the norms is becoming that key. So why do we think this is important? So, and especially in our context. So why should we queer ABE? So let's look at, there are some really great quotes here. I'm going to be quiet for a second. Oh, there's some good stuff here in the chat, but I'm going to be quiet. I'm going to let you kind of reflect on these, and then we're going to summarize them in just a second. So one of the things that I really think of in terms of my why is this important, is because especially in adult education, we are looking to build identity with our students, and not just build their identity, but have them build confidence and safety within who they are. And so we want to, and we need to think about, why are we choosing the curriculum that we're choosing? Who are we representing? And who is included? Who is left out? And by what are we saying by who we're choosing to include? And what is being said louder by who we're leaving out? And also, how are we setting these norms? And whether that's in a math word problem or a reading that you're using, how are we supporting the norm? And not that we shouldn't have conversations about we should be having conversations about all different kinds of identity, and how that really impacts our students' ability to feel welcome, to feel safe, to take risks. and see themselves in the work that they're doing. And I think especially when we're looking at how are we going to dismantle the norm to ensure that every student feels like they have seen themselves in our work, that they have seen themselves as valued and important. As a student I'm a mathematician, and I never have seen a queer identity represented in a college math textbook in my experience, or I have never learned about a queer mathematician, or I'm bombarded with representations of women being secretaries and that's all we can be. And so thinking about how those messages are internalized to us and how that impacts how we see ourselves in the world. So these are some things as we're kind of moving on, is how our students and how we as ourselves are having identity in the work that we're doing.
Yeah, and to respond to the question in the chat from two, what if students already come into the class with entrenched ideas? That's definitely going to happen because we're all adults and we've all been taught things and we all have firm beliefs or maybe kind of constructs about the world that could use some disruption and some rethinking. Even if, you know, we're not asking anyone to change what they fundamentally believe or to discount their own experience as much as to just allow other viewpoints to sort of, you know, inform how they see and experience the world and especially the classroom. And I think it's important to point out that this process is always for us as much as it is for the students, right? So continuing these questions, I hopefully can also help to answer that question a bit more. Why are we querying instruction? I think there's a couple of obvious trends in ABE that jumped out at me as we were preparing for this discussion. This is an extension of ongoing ABE efforts in our field to increase complexity, critical thinking, to ask that dial to be turned up in our classrooms, and to examine bias in sources, right? That there's not just one point of view that informs data or information. From Pais again, that students can better advocate for themselves and for others in their first and other languages. It's also a feature of culturally responsive pedagogy, which we've all probably been hearing, reading about. I was speaking about in my session with Ishu yesterday. Inviting a variety of approaches and perspectives to build meaning together in learning partnerships between ourselves and our students, and to ignore the idea of approaching things to disrupt and to reconsider, rebuild meaning, to assume that our students are unable to handle that, of course, cast them as deficient learners, which is unfair to them, and to assume that we are not able to handle this method of instruction is unfair to us as educators. So this allows learning partnerships to grow as we as educators commit to questioning, growing, co-creating knowledge with our students. So this is a way to legitimately perform allyship with different types of folks in our classroom. It lets our queer students see themselves, but it lets people of all backgrounds see themselves and bring themselves into the discussion and instruction. So in this way, we're modeling and inviting students' diverse points of entry into problem solving, analysis, making space for a lot of perspectives. Is there anything in the chat that I missed?
So I'm seeing there's some really interesting points about that power dynamic, especially in mathematics, and how who gets to be a mathematician and whose voice is important in that world is really important. as we're kind of looking at trying to make all of our students feel like they can be mathematicians, no matter what their socioeconomic background is, no matter what their cultural background is. And Clarice adds a point in here about the LGBTQ youth experience, which actually she doesn't know my slides, but fits right into what I wanted to mention really, that I was just devastating to me, as I have not ever looked at the research of how are queer students impacted with math. And that's obviously something as a math teacher I care about. Some of the data that I'm coming across that I need to digest more, because I feel like Clarice's point of, a lot of this data is coming from K-12 students. Can you imagine the amplification of this issue for our ABE students? And so a point of research that I have found was that passing LGB students are so nervous, are least likely to complete Algebra 2 than their LGBT colleagues, which is really important because Algebra 2 is this gatekeeper. It's seen as this gatekeeper for all populations to college success, and especially into STEM career success. So LGBT students are least likely to pass this class. How does that keep them from making goals, while also knowing and understanding that there are a lot of other identity places that come in for our students? Knowing that there are lots of identities that our students are bringing into this, and oftentimes they may be students of color, they may be of low socioeconomic status, they may be female or identify as female. So there's lots of other things that keep them from that, which we know as ABE teachers is huge for our students' long-term success. Also, GLSEN, which is an organization that looks at queer issues in education, looked at curriculum and found that math was the least likely place to see an LGBTQ inclusive curriculum, which is no surprise to those of us who've looked at a math book, but thinking if we're trying to tell anybody that they can be a mathematician and there's not inclusion in this curriculum, that's really hard. I also want to note that in this research, you're going to notice that our trans brothers and sisters aren't included in this. And that's really important because there's additional research that's been done on trans identifying students and how their success is even more dampened in these different contexts. And so as we're looking at that, they are not included in this data, but they should not be forgotten, that they have additional challenges that they're overcoming, as it's even harder to see meaningful and accurate trans representation in any curriculum. So we've set this.
Erin, do you want to jump in real quick?
Sure, yeah. I wasn't sure if Amber was just frozen for me. So we have set the stage. Yep, okay.
Go ahead, Erin, go ahead.
So we have put together a few sort of principles or just sort of opportunities. I feel like principles is a very like top-down anti-queering word, but to help us queer our instruction. And these are just kind of, buckets that we put some observations into, and we'll show you examples in ELA and math associated with each one. So a few opportunities for queering instruction. Something we noticed was inclusion of language and terms representing queer lives. So of course, we'll see terms representing various LGBTQIA plus sexuality and gender identities, like the very terms in that acronym, gender pronouns beyond the binary, and non-gendered language like siblings, spouse, parents, that kind of thing. Those are sort of the low-hanging fruit that I think a lot of us are already trying to think about how they could appear in our instruction in an ongoing way. Then in our second category in the center, we have inclusion of content representing queer lives. So this would be items like texts, articles, literature, poetry, grammatical examples, infographics, mathematical word problems that represent queer experiences. These could be like biographies, news stories, literature by queer authors, or queer themes. And yeah, some of these other pretty straightforward suggestions. And then maybe a slightly newer category for some, queering habits of mind. So this is something we were just speaking about, welcoming or encouraging approaches to analyzing ideas and information that question or push against traditional, very often white or Western cis heteropatriarchal expectations. Thank you, Amber. We will show you some examples of what this looks like in context. And as Amber said earlier, we know that you are the best people to actually apply these as it makes sense within your instruction or in your context. But this is just to kind of give you a glimpse as to what it could look like. So here are a few examples. Starting with the first category of inclusion of language and terms representing queer lives. Amber, are you able to walk through your examples? She might still be handling kids on computers. So she has a standard for you here, Math CCRS level A. You can see there are a couple word problems available that incorporate queer inclusive language.
Are you able to hear me?
Oh, yep. Yeah, go right ahead. Walk through your word problems. Oh, shoot. Now I can't hear you. All right. I'm going to continue and then just talk over me when you can. Jacob and his moms went to the library.
Are you able to hear me now?
Yep.
All right. So are you able to hear me, Erin?
Yeah.
Okay, great. I'm just running because that's what we do, just run. So one of the things that we want to see is that these are pretty low-hanging fruits in terms of what we're able to incorporate. So in these problems, you're going to see just using that vocabulary of Jacob and his moms, they're going to the library, normalizing that a kid has two moms, then they're doing normal people stuff. But it's not really pushing or dismantling any kind of crazy expectations in that aspect. In our second problem, we've got information about Cade, and they're eating some stuff at their lunch break, and we're able to kind of normalize using non-binary pronouns inside of a word problem.
Okay. Moving on then to an ELA example. So this one you may have seen before, presented as part of the sort of 1.0 queering session. Shout out to Chris Kloss and Jamie Kreil for putting this together. And I think we have a link for where it's available on the IamABE website. So they made a beginner level, it's called School Story. It's a lesson plan with a lot of materials to support teaching singular they pronouns. It's embedded in a lesson about personal pronouns overall. So you'll see that there's a person represented with singular they pronouns, singular female and male pronouns, and then plural they pronouns. And we see them all doing activities. It's very simple. And provided along with the story is like an infogap activity, a mingle, a table with, going over all the subject pronouns, a checklist for an assessment activity. And I did want to note that the images from this are taken from a gender spectrum stock photo library that's available through the Vice website, like Vice magazine. And that is also available with the lesson plan. If you go to the IamABE website, you will see this among our lessons and curricula. It's also available with our resources at the end of the presentation.
So Erin, I'm seeing in the chat some comments about getting kind of this, how do we start this with students, or how do we deal with especially these different pronouns? And I want you to hear that even in grad school, I had to fight with my grad school advisor when I was working on my thesis about how I could use the word they as a singular pronoun. So there's definitely a mindset shift that's happening. And I also wanted to really highlight Marisa's comment about we're not going to be perfect in this work, and nor should we expect our students to be perfect in this work. This work requires a lot of us to give ourselves and each other grace. If we make mistakes, we fix it, we correct it, and then we do better as we move on in the future. And you'll hear that, and I appreciate in some of my language, I'm not always as inclusive as I can be. And I have my friends who are feeling comfortable and safe to say, hey, don't forget these guys, these humans and these people. And that's really important, because that is the way that we move together as a community. And so one of the things that I didn't get to say because of my family and internet issues is that when it's real life, right? So one of the things that's really important is that we want to make sure that when we're setting up these problems and these experiences, that it's not just this very special episode of ABE, that it's a real life, real meaningful, purposeful integration, but not something that's like special or noted. For those of us who have looked at old school social studies textbooks, we'll remember that all the women used to be placed in blue boxes on the side of the page, that they were never really meaningfully integrated. And so how can we keep these issues and our students and our community from just being relegated into the blue box on the back of the chapter? So thinking about that more meaningfully. Yeah. So these are kind of our starter examples, right, Erin?
Yeah. Yeah, and I also wanted to mention that I think these are, as I think Amber was already saying, important to bring into an explicit lesson about pronouns, but also to include, as she did in her math examples, throughout your curriculum, right? This needs to be explicitly taught and maybe retaught and included in other lessons where pronouns are a part of the language being emphasized. Okay, moving on to our second opportunity for queering, inclusion of content representing queer lives.
So in this example, for those of you who teach mathematics, I really want to encourage you to check out the queer mathematics teacher. She has really great resources. She presents nationally. She shares lots of her stuff, which I think is really helpful. And in this, we're looking at this problem and we're noticing this problem actually could be used in looking at ratios, fractions. There's lots of different kinds of contexts we could use this problem in. But if you'll notice, we're looking at gender in TV. And without these guiding questions, and we just had students talking about these genders, you're going to notice that there's a blue box for boys and a pink box for girls, and the girls have a dress and the boys have pants. And our students may not even think about what those images, what those icons represent. Also, if you're looking at what the content of this is, it's about TV characters in STEM roles. So there's a lot of opportunity here where we could just talk about the ratio or the fraction, about men in this group, about women in this group. But in the box on the left, I want you to kind of notice that the questions are really guiding our students to think about and focus on this notice and wonder of who's included, who's missed, and what happens to our understanding if we consider who are we missing and what happens when we add different perspectives, different people, different representations into this data. And so I think that that's something that is maybe something we don't always do, but it's something really important to consider, how we could elevate something and confront and deconstruct some of these biases just in the prompt itself.
Thank you. And An example in an ELA setting might be using News ELA, which is a source I know a lot of us go to. It has an adjustable lexile level, so you can apply this in a variety of, I would say mainly high beginning to more advanced contexts. It's very easily searchable. So this is an easy way to grab content available across a range of student lexile levels. Here we have an example of trans activism in history, Compton's cafeteria riot, a historic act of trans resistance, which was a action taken even before Stonewall that a lot of people haven't learned about. So this is just to sort of talk about how accessible a lot of these texts can be.
So our third section here is querying our habits of mind. So you may have you may feel like, okay, I can try 1 and 2. That's totally fine. I got that. But our goal here is to move past something we've learned, Erin and I, in our research about this idea of add, queer, and stir. So just changing pronouns in a word problem is not enough to really do this work and do this work meaningfully, but it's a starting place. So how are we going to progress through add, queer, and stir to further our efforts? So queering really involves disrupting this idea of normal and norms and throughout the entirety of our learning experience. And so what we want is, as we're querying, to explore complex intersectional experiences in really deep and meaningful ways for our students. So our third section is going to be, how do we look at this in a bigger picture way? So in this problem, it's a very similar, it's a graphic. There's a lot of really great social justice stuff that can happen around data. I think a lot of great statistic stuff's out there for us to really play with and think about. In this problem, we're exploring intersectionality in a really meaningful way. It's something that maybe students hadn't done before, because it's hard to read because there's little font, but it's looking at men and women. Notice men is blue again, women is red or pink again, but then also going down and looking at different identities. And how these are all comparing. And so when we're looking at this, the questions are mostly repeated from the last one, but there's this purposeful engagement with the focus on the complexity of identity and how these come into play. So kind of taking it to that next level.
Great. And my example for ELA, and this is something that, depending on activities that you would develop around the text, could be used at multiple levels. I would say at the lowest, maybe a CCRS B band level and up. I don't know if people are familiar with this absolutely wonderful novel, Hey Hmong Girl, What's Up? A Journal of Chua Bang. So this was written, I think, as part of somebody's PhD research at Hamlin. It is written by a St. Paul author and educator. And it is very authentic to the Frogtown area of St. Paul. I was reading it at Hmong American Partnership with my students years ago, and it was like, we walked along Sherburne Avenue, and I was like, that's behind the school. It's a beautiful young adult novel about a young Hmong girl who is growing up and dealing with some different strife in her family, her identity as a refugee and as an English language learner in her high school, trying to, make friends, have romances. So it's very like fun and juicy content. Anyone would enjoy this book, truly anyone. You can see a wonderful quote here. A lot of kids can't imagine a Hmong kid writing a book. They think Hmong kids are stupid because they go to the ESL classroom for extra help and they don't talk English perfectly. It's just that we grew up speaking another language and that we have a lot of catching up to do. So she gives her experiences as a firsthand account, which I think is a really wonderful opportunity to kind of consider how people's own perspective on a situation may impact how they perceive it. It represents her own experience. It refutes a lot of stereotypes explicitly. You can see right here that she's talking about preconceptions about Hmong kids, that she's part of that group, but it also represents one single person's experience. So not sort of essentializing what things are like for all Hmong kids. And it models her very unique voice. She loves her culture, but Hmong girls can be many things, right? Chua is a writer, and that's something she identifies as. She also learns that she has her own stereotypes about others that are misguided, as she finds out. So it's a great opportunity to consider multiple perspectives and how we all have to learn from how others see the world. And it's just a total joy to read.
So we're so ready, Erin. So as we are wrapping up our time together today, there are additional resources we wanted to share with you as we have gone along our process and our research. So we have uploaded this to Sched. These are available to you. We want to also encourage you, as you have resources, to share them with us, because we are by no means experts. So Erin, let's look at some of those resources. So we've got some right here, homegrown in Minnesota ABE. So Erin, do you want to talk about some of those?
Sure. I mentioned the IamABE website, the pronoun lesson plan. There are other curricula available there that kind of represent how to represent your own voice, refute stereotypes, get involved with your community, represent your voice to government representatives. You can also watch, as I said, the Literacy Minnesota training calendar for our quote unquote 1.0 session on LGBTQIA plus representation in ABE spaces. We also, if you identify as part of the queer community, we have an affinity group on Facebook. It is a private group. So if you want to email me at erin@lindale.org, I'm happy to get you into that group. And you can share that space with us and talk about being a queer person in ABE or a questioning person in ABE. Also Minnesota-wide, we have some wonderful resources. So in Minneapolis Public Schools has a great organization for educators called Out for Good. And the website is here. Out for Equity is the version in St. Paul Public Schools, and they both have a lot of resources available for educators. They've been around for years, so they have a lot to offer. And Outfront Minnesota, which I think is statewide.
And all of those organizations have really robust educator tabs. So make sure that when you're going to those websites, knowing that there are educational resources. In addition to things that you'll see in Minnesota, these are just a very, very quick snapshot of some of the things that you'll see that there are some national resources. We've tried to include a couple different kinds of resources on here for you to look at on your own time. I did include the queer mathematics teacher on there because there are lots of really great resources for you as you're getting started there. So you'll have access to all of these, but we want to know what's not on our list that should be. So if you have any resources that are tried and true for you, or ones that you find thought-provoking or useful, please put them in the chat. We would love to be able to continue this conversation. Thank you, Chris, for adding those as well. Erin, it is 1:45. We are really hopeful that this conversation can continue. I'm really grateful and thankful for all of you that came and participated. There were some great questions we didn't get to in the chat, and we saw you, but we didn't get to them. We really want to encourage you to reach out to us. We would love to continue this conversation. you are not alone in this work, and we would love to be able to be alongside you as we are working through our process. Look, we're in my kitchen now. Thank you for being flexible and supportive of us in our work, and I really look forward to continuing this as we move on.
Feel free to reach out to us anytime. My email is erin@lindale.org. I don't know if you want to put yours in the chat too, Amber, but we're happy to work together on anything that will keep this conversation moving forward.
Thank you so much, everyone.